It's a question every gardener asks themselves when they're cleaning up a bed just before they pull a plant out of the ground. And of course, all of us have made the mistake when we pull a plant that we didn't intend to. Join me today as I share with you some insight and help answer the question, is it a weed? Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and when it comes to cleaning up my garden beds, like most of us, we have to approach the dreaded chore of weeding at some point or another. Now, as far as I'm concerned, a weed is simply a plant that's in the wrong location. Sometimes there are plants that we are intentionally growing in other beds, but they suddenly pop up in one particular bed. And if that plant, even though it's a treasured plant elsewhere, if it's in the wrong spot, it can be considered a weed. Before I pull that plant out of the ground, I always consider two basic factors. Is it a plant that I intentionally put into this garden bed in a spot I want it to be? And secondly, does it need to be removed at all? Even if it isn't a plant that I put the seed or the plant in the ground, maybe it's okay to leave it. Often it's very easy to answer that question. In this bed, I'm growing pepper plants. And so when I see something like these pop up, they're not peppers. I didn't put them in the ground. I don't want them remaining because they're going to eventually grow pretty big. So these are weeds, and they need to be removed. Now, it's important to point out with this approach to weeding that you don't need to know what kind of plant this is. All I know is it's a weed. Now, it looks like it could be a dandelion or something similar, and with experience, you'll be able to identify the weeds in your garden. But for me, for this bed, and right now, all it is a weed. Now, it helps if you can identify the plants that you're growing on purpose. So I know in this section of the bed that I put Swiss chard seeds in. So as I begin weeding this area, it's helpful to know what a Swiss chard plant looks like. I've grown it before, and I can identify that this plant and this plant are Swiss chard, which means everything else is not. So this plant, while it looks quite similar, is actually a lamb's ear. And I've learned that over time because this is a very prevalent weed. Edible, you can use it in a salad, but it doesn't belong right here. This low plant falls into that same basic category. It's purslane. It's also edible, also can be eaten in a salad, but it doesn't belong where the Swiss chard is. These other plants, I don't know what they are, but I didn't plant them. They're interfering with this Swiss chard that will continue to grow, so they need to be pulled. Plant identification of the weeds can be important, especially if you want to pull the lamb's ear and the purslane and use them in your kitchen. It isn't as important as plant identification when it comes to the vegetable garden plants and the flower plants that you are intentionally growing. Because when you have a choice between the plants and trying to decide whether to pull it or not, it helps to know what you're pulling. And that's why I said earlier, all of us have made that mistake and have pulled the plants that we really wanted to grow. There are many seedlings growing in this area right next to this tomatillo, and the tomatillo is the primary plant in this area, but I also spread some seeds. I spread cilantro seeds. So to be able to help in deciding what's a weed or not, I like to wait until the seedlings are an inch or two high and have begun to set their true leaves, because many of these plants will look the same when they're very small. Looking at this plant right here, I can look at the leaves and recognize that as a cilantro leaf. It's the same leaf on a full-grown plant that I would see on the seed packet. But this one right next to it doesn't have that leaf. And even this plant, as I'll talk about in just a second, doesn't look the same. It's a weed and needs to be pulled. These little grasses are easy to decide. Some of the others, like this little one right here, is probably a cilantro, but I'm going to keep it and let it grow a little bit more before I make the decision to pull. It's also helpful to remember not only what seeds you sowed this year, but what you grew in the bed last year. Right now I've got tomatoes growing along with these tomatillos. Last year, I also grew tomatoes in this bed. And some of those cherry tomatoes at the end of the season had fallen down to the soil surface. Well, it should come as no surprise to me or you that those tomato seeds are likely to germinate if the conditions are right. This plant, that looks just like the other one I pulled, is a tomato plant. Doesn't deserve to be here. I don't want tomatoes growing right next to my tomatillos, so it's a weed. But looking around, I can see that there are some other cilantro plants growing, a couple unidentified ones, and this bed has effectively been weeded in this section. It only takes 1 or 2 gardening seasons for you to begin to recognize the plants that you grow on a regular basis. Tomatoes have a very distinctive leaf, so you'll be able to spot a tomato plant, whether you planted it or it just grew from a seed. There are others that have very distinctive leaves as well, like this asparagus. I could spot asparagus from 10 or 15 feet away. And that's why, as I continued to clean up this bed, I discovered I have an asparagus plant growing right here. Now, I didn't put asparagus here. I don't want asparagus here, and this plant is a weed. A bird probably dropped an asparagus seed and it sprouted here. But another factor enters into play. I like asparagus. In fact, I like the idea of spreading asparagus in the beds I have, or maybe to another bed. So can I save this plant? Even though it's a weed in this bed, should I consider transplanting it and moving it someplace else? I could have easily done that with those tomato weeds that I pulled earlier. Those tomato plants would never be able to grow high enough to give me the fruit I want in my short season. But this asparagus, because it takes years to grow, I think it makes sense to try to put this someplace else. And I'm asking myself the same question in this area of my new pollinator garden. Last year I grew cosmos in this spot right here, and I allowed the seeds to fall and I spread some of the seeds into other areas, and I have a whole bunch of cosmos growing in this area. Well, I have too many. I need to thin out this area. So those plants that I'm thinning out are weeds. They'll be interfering with the plants I want to remain. But because it's a flower I want and that I want to spread, it makes sense to try to transplant the weeds from this part of the flower garden. It's the same with other plants in my garden as well. As I showed in a recent video about these raspberries, they're spreading and they're beginning to interfere with some of the flowers in this pollinator garden. So a small plant like this one is a weed. I didn't put it here. I don't want it here. It's beginning to interfere with the flowers, so it needs to go. But if I can dig it up and pot it up, that allows me to move raspberry plants to another area of the garden where I want a new raspberry bed. But even though I'm trying to save my cosmos plants, right here, this one and this one and this one are weeds, because this is borage, and I did the same thing where I allowed the seed to fall. I want borage in this area and not the cosmos. And sometimes a plant that wasn't a weed yesterday becomes a weed today. In this bed where I have a lot of tomato plants, I also have cover crops, different plants to help shade the soil, improve the soil, and give me biomass for my compost pile and as mulches. One of those plants is a daikon radish. Now, in my heat, some of the daikon radish have begun bolting. They're setting flowers and will soon set seeds. And these plants are beginning to interfere with some of the tomato plants directly behind them. So while I am intentionally growing these plants like the daikon radish, it's a weed today and now becomes mulch. I just pull these plants that are getting too big and interfering, and then just drop them right back on the soil to decompose and to help add to the mulch I already have. I'm also growing a cover crop in this bed. This is specifically hairy vetch. It's one of my favorite cover crops. It flowers early in my season and helps attract pollinators, and it's wonderful for improving the soil. Last year I grew hairy vetch throughout this garden bed, most of the season. But at one point it did begin interfering with the strawberries in this bed. At that point I didn't pull the plants out completely. I just trimmed them back so that they wouldn't interfere with my primary food crop in this bed. And now this year they're back, and I'll do the same basic approach again. And what about these kind of plants that are growing just outside my raised beds? I didn't plant them here. They're the type of plants that most of us would consider weeds, but they're not interfering. And in fact, many of them are food for my rabbits who would otherwise eat my garden plants, and they attract some of the beneficial insects like ladybugs. For me, these aren't weeds. They're just part of my garden. And so when it comes to answering the question, is it a weed? Often there's no easy answer other than it depends. It depends on that plant in that location on that day. And each of those factors may change in time, which is why I often give my weeds time to grow, time for me to identify them, and time for me to decide whether it should stay or go. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.